One day he got into a boat with his disciples, and he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side of the lake." So they set out, and as they sailed, he fell asleep. And a windstorm came down on the lake, and they were filling with water and were in danger. And they went and woke him, saying, "Master, Master, we are perishing." And he awoke and rebuked the wind and the raging waves, and they ceased. And there was a calm. And he said to them, "Where is your faith?" And they were afraid, and they marveled, saying to one another, "Who is this that he commands even winds and water, and they obey him?"
As you saw in my very quick review, in the first 21 verses of chapter 8, we were seeing Jesus teaching rather than narrative where he is moving around and doing miracles and things like that. And mostly he was teaching using figurative language, parables and proverbs, and even explained a bit why he teaches in figurative language. He's pointing out heavenly spiritual truths, which are difficult to grasp, and which finally can only really be grasped by the children of God, which in the parable of the sower would be the good soil. And it may not spring up immediately, but when the people who are destined to understand it receive the seed, the word, and they cling to it, their understanding will grow, and they'll finally become a light to other people. And so Jesus was teaching difficult to understand heavenly lessons using earthly stories, parables, and proverbs, and so on. The remaining verses of chapter 8, all the way to the end of it, are, on the contrary, narrative text centered on miracles, all right? And so these stories, I call them, or these memories of the early church of things that Jesus did, and in particular some of the major miracles that are the center of these stories, are less teaching of the first type, and they're more sort of what you might say, using a fancy word, Christological. They're teaching about Jesus Christ, who he is, what authority he had, what power he had, who he was. In a sense, it's a little bit like a continuation of the stories we saw in chapter 7, which I just reviewed, which were showing how the Roman centurion and Jewish people and John the Baptist were struggling to understand about Jesus and who he was and what. We see that in these stories also. But I hasten to say both things are difficult to understand. It's not easy to understand parables. The teachings of Jesus, Jesus' own disciples went to Jesus and said, what does it mean? The parable is looking for a spiritual insight in the listener, which, if it's there, will be met with understanding by and by. But I think when Jesus does amazing things, it was difficult for the people in his day, certainly, to understand. They always think, who is this, who he can command the storm and so on? Their reaction was one of confusion and uncertainty, because Jesus is absolutely unique. They've never seen, and they never will see, anybody like him. And so when they see him in action, it's hard to understand who he is. And even when we read the Bible, it's not totally easy for us to understand some of these stories. So the first story, this is a picture that may help you think of what the first story looked like for parts of the drama. And this is a story about how Jesus calmed a storm. Now, this is an important story. Of course, everything in the Bible is important, but this is 3 times in the Bible. It's in Matthew, it's in Mark, and it's in Luke. And generally speaking, when each of the gospel authors keeps a story in its own gospel record, that's a good sign that it's a story that the early church cared a lot about and found deep meaning in, and felt it was important to include in any story about Jesus. Not every story appears in every gospel, but some do. This one that Steve just read does appear in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Mark's version of the story, which we studied in this class not too long ago, you may recall, remembers this beginning in the evening. Jesus had been teaching the parables of the seeds and whatnot, which I just reviewed in Mark's gospel. It got late. It was coming to the evening, and then they were near the seashore where Jesus had been teaching, so they set out across the lake and then something similar to this, or exactly the same thing, happened there. When Matthew and Luke tell the same story, they don't say what time of day it is. They just say one day here, because you see they know that the story is important and it needs to be included in their way. They're describing Jesus' life, but to them it's not important to connect it time-wise to what went immediately before. In Luke's gospel, what went immediately before was Jesus' mother and brothers, and Luke wanted to talk about that there. So now he begins the story of the crossing of the lake and the storm just by saying, okay, here's another story. One day when he got into a boat, and he goes forward from here. It says here Jesus got into a boat with his disciples. The way that Luke's been writing it would be natural to understand that would include the 12 apostles, which, as we just reviewed, he'd named. It might include other men and women, possibly or even likely including some of the women that he went out of his way to name at the beginning of chapter 8. Perhaps even some of Jesus' family members who have recently joined the Bible story in Luke's gospel. We're not told how many people beyond the 12 were with Jesus, but suffice it to say that it's a pretty large group of people. So if you had in your mind a tiny little boat, you're probably wrong. The picture I had up before, just to include the people that are involved, would have had to have been a fairly large boat, probably because of the size and also because of the vocabulary that's being used. The commentators say it probably was a sailing vessel. You can see sails on this boat. And I guess one point I take from it in the imagery is a big boat, big enough to hold 12 or 15 or 20 people, however many there were, that's fit to sail on a big lake, like what's called the Sea of Galilee or Lake Gennesaret, is a fairly seaworthy vessel. And so in order to fill it with water by wind, it has to be a really big storm that came. A smaller boat might struggle with even a light storm, but this is probably a fairly big storm, as is shown in this picture. A dramatic storm. And remember that people who were piloting the boat are professional fishermen who are familiar with that particular body of water. So it's like their profession to drive boats around on the Sea of Galilee. So it's probably a big boat and good seamen. Mark refers to there being other boats, which Matthew and Luke don't remember, and so I don't know. It's possible that the crowd actually included more than one boat. But the main story happens in the boat where Jesus is. So he gets into the boat with his disciples, and he says to his disciples, let's go to the other side. So keep in mind, I've been thinking about this all day, that all of the events which follow involving the disciples involve them because they are disciples of Jesus. The only reason why they're in the boat and all the things that happened is that they were following him. They followed him into the boat, and he said, let's go to the other side, and they went with him. And if the professional fishermen in the boat were worried about the weather, none of them said anything, but Jesus has just decided to go. So far there's nothing unusual. They're living around the Sea of Galilee. They want to go to the other side. Jesus' disciples get in with them. And had they simply crossed over, had an easy crossing to the other side where they were going, this story wouldn't be in the Bible. Nobody would care. What makes all of the significance that comes out of this story happen is the fact that there was a storm, right? All the lasting benefit of this teaching is because there was a storm, and that's something worth pondering. So as they get going, as they sailed, it says that Jesus falls asleep. Some people who have read this story over the years have thought, oh, Jesus must have been pretending to sleep in order to test the faith, of his disciples. But that seems wrong to me, and it seems wrong to most commentators. I think Luke says what he means. They were sailing, and Jesus fell asleep, sort of by accident, as you would do in a boat, because you're tired. He's been preaching all day, because you're comfortable, because you trust your disciples to steer the boat, okay, because you trust God, because you are the Son of God and God. But the human being, Jesus, just fell asleep as he was going in the boat Probably. And so what that means, and you have to stop and think about this for a while, it means that even though Jesus was all of the things that we're all struggling to understand, is for that time when he was asleep, he was in a sense absent from their waking fellowship. I mean, usually he's leading things around by speaking and by leading and by doing miracles and everything. But right now, he's sleeping, probably snoring. He was a man. And so Jesus is kind of missing from the action here as the scene develops. And you might want to cause your mind to reflect on other times when Jesus has been missing. You know, when Jesus was 12 years old, his mother and father realized he was missing. He was in the temple in Jerusalem, and they went to look for him. Sometimes Jesus is off praying by himself, and people can't find him, and they go to look for him. Between the time he was crucified and the time of the resurrection, Jesus was missing from the face of the earth, so far as we know, for 3 days. After his ascension, and even until now, Jesus, the man, is missing. You and I have never seen Jesus there. And so, in a sense, although these disciples' whole importance, centers around the fact that they are disciples and they're alive when Jesus was and they follow him around, some of the times, even for them, Jesus was missing. When he was asleep, when he was away, when he was praying. And we're seeing what happens with them when Jesus is not leading the action, and something bad starts to happen, right? So, an example of Jesus' absence is sort of inserted here into the narrative of Jesus' active life on earth. All right, so even though he has all power, the universe is created through him, and we have this high view of Christ that we can have. Eternally, he's God. He's all-powerful. When he's on earth as a man, sometimes he simply falls asleep. Right? And his disciples feel the absence of his presence. They're alone. They're without him. And they really feel it acutely when suddenly a windstorm sweeps down on them and starts filling their boat with water. And their feeling is, oh, we're in danger. And again, these are professional fishermen, a lot of them, so they know what danger looks like if you're in a boat on the Sea of Galilee, which, by the way, to this day is famous for its windstorms. It's a particular problem on the Sea of Galilee because it's lower than sea level and the wind sweeps in, and they have a lot of problems even now. So they have a problem, and we read that they went and they woke Jesus, saying, "Master, Master, we are perishing." And he awoke and rebuked the wind and the raging waves, and they ceased, and there was calm, right? So most people who have thought about this for a while would say that the fact that they were afraid because a windstorm was filling their boat with water is not any kind of a sin. It's completely natural. You know, if your boat is filling with water in the middle of a windstorm, you should be afraid. That's kind of the normal human reaction. And that they reacted to this frightful circumstance by waking up Jesus is, if anything, an indication of their faith. They suddenly felt his absence. He was the one who they trusted to be their leader. He was sleeping. Something bad was happening, and so they wanted him to be awake. The phrase here, the Greek translated master, master, is epistatis, which is a word which is like foreman or leader. It's not teacher here. They're actually calling him as the leader of their troop. The leader of this group of people who are in trouble. And when you're in trouble, you call the captain or the leader of the troop to wake them up, right? In any context, and here also. So the same faith that caused these guys to follow Jesus around, the same faith that caused them to get into the boat with him, the same faith that caused them to agree with Jesus to go to the other side of the lake, is the same faith that caused them to wake Jesus up, when they had a problem, when there was danger. And I don't get any evidence in Luke's accounting. The others show a bit more of a rebuke on Jesus' part. But the way Luke tells the story, Jesus does not seem to be upset that they woke him up. He doesn't, "Why did you wake me up? I was having a nice sleep," or something. Jesus is, they wake him up, and that's fairly normal. And what does Jesus do when he wakes up? He rebukes not them. He rebukes the storm. He looks at the waves and the wind, and he says, "Stop," and they stop. It's instantly calm. And this is what you see in Jesus everywhere in the Gospels, is Jesus can do anything, and when he does it, he doesn't break a sweat. It's easy for him to command the storm to be calm, and it doesn't take time. Okay. Right. So I think the slight tension, though, that remains even in Luke's gospel surrounds the sentence which I've underlined, is because when they woke Jesus up, they seemed to be in a bit of a panic. We are perishing. We're dying. Right? As if their fear had gotten to the point where they thought, oh, maybe this is a danger which is so bad that even Jesus can't help us. All right. So that doesn't indicate they have no faith. There's every indication they have faith. What it indicates is that their faith is still growing. Like everybody else, their understanding of just who Jesus is, just how powerful Jesus is, just what kind of authority Jesus is growing and growing and growing, and will continue to grow on out into the Acts of the Apostles. But at this stage in their life, there's still possible to scare them really bad if there's a windstorm, and for them to maybe be a little bit too fearful when they wake Jesus up, although not even that's totally clear that Luke is trying to say that in here. Anyway, they were afraid, and they woke him up. And the point here is not to rebuke their faith, but to grow their faith. One of the reasons why God caused the storm was to grow their faith. And that's one of the things that we're seeing to happen here. There's no coincidences, right? Everything that happens by God's permission. God, and we read in Romans, God works all things together for the good of those who are called according to his purpose, which certainly includes Jesus' disciples. And so everything we see happening to them is happening because God wanted it to happen to them and for their benefit. None of this is happening for anything other than their benefit. What they're learning here is more about Jesus. But Jesus wants to help them learn that lesson, and so he says at the beginning of verse 25, actually literally in Greek it says, where your faith. It's much fuzzier than it is in English. He's asking them to consider their faith in this context, right? They're his disciples. They know something about him. There was just a big storm. They were kind of panicking, maybe over much. They woke him up, and right away he solved the problem. And now he says to them within the context of the solved problem, what about your faith? Didn't you guys think I was really able to handle that? You know, why were you so afraid? Right, and so that then leads them to not a guilt feeling for not having been faithful, but to a revelation, an epiphany concerning the nature of Christ, their Lord. This is not a story about how their faith is weak. This is a story about how they're growing to understand just how great Jesus is. So when they say, who is this that he commands even the winds and the water and they obey him, they're saying, this is really confusing because, you know, there were in those days all kinds of stories in Jewish literature and in Greek literature and other literature about weather miracles and people who could command the sea and everyone, but it was all fables and gods. But among men, there was hardly any stories, if you parse through all the literature, hardly any stories where a human being went out and commanded a storm to stop and it stopped. There aren't even stories like that. And yet Jesus is a human being. We're at great pains to this far in Luke to understand he was born like a normal baby. He is a human being, and yet he is a human being who can command a storm and it stops. And what it means is he's a human, but he's not like any other human. He's the only human who's also God. What he does here, only God could do, and yet he is a human. And can you see how hard it is for people to understand that, even his disciples? Right? So while the mortal Jesus is sleeping, I'm quoting John Calvin, the rest of the Godhead is on the watch, he's saying. I mean, Jesus was sleeping, but God the Father and God the Holy Spirit weren't silent. They had everything in hand. John Calvin in the Reformation can perceive that, but who could perceive that then, right? Is they're just in the early days of living with Jesus. Or to quote me instead of John Calvin, I was thinking, when Jesus was awake, if you looked in his eyes, it was the eyes of God.
してイエスが起きて見たときはその目は神様の目であるわけです。
You know, because Jesus didn't do any magical wind up. He doesn't say abracadabra. He doesn't pray because he's God.
もう神様です。
He just says
イエスは祈りはしませんでした。
peace and the whole storm stops, right? Can you imagine how freaking out that would be to see a human being say stop and the storm stops even when a moment before you thought you were ready to die, right? And so again, this is not a moral teaching about faith so much as it is a Christological teaching about the nature of Jesus Christ and how great he is. And we're starting to get some sort of Trinitarian soundings here, that the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit sort of hover around this story a bit also, although it's early for the church to be thinking about those kind of things. So anyhow, these stories helped us understand more about Jesus and his relationship to God.
見て私たちはまたイエスがどういうお方であるのかを学ぶことができます。
And so then, the next story.
それで次のお話ですね。
Steve, you can restart at verse 26 and
Through 39.
through 39.
Okay, just to double check that. No problem. Okay. Then they sailed to the country of the Gerasenes, which is opposite Galilee. When Jesus had stepped out on land, there met him a man from the city who had demons. For a long time he had worn no clothes, and he had not lived in a house, but among the tombs. When he saw Jesus, he cried out and fell down before him and said with a loud voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me." For he had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man. For many a time it had seized him. He was kept under guard and bound with chains and shackles, but he would break the bonds and be driven by the demon into the desert. Jesus then asked him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Legion," for many demons had entered him. And they begged him not to command them to depart into the abyss. Now a large herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him to let them enter these. So he gave them permission. Then the demons came out of the man and entered the pigs. And the herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and drowned. When the herdsmen saw what had happened, they fled and told it in the city and in the country. Then the people went out to see what had happened, and they came to Jesus and found the man from whom the demons had gone, sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. And those who had seen it told them how the demon-possessed man had been healed. Then all the people of the surrounding country of the Gerasenes asked him to depart from them, for they were seized with great fear. So he got into the boat and returned. The man from whom the demons had gone begged that he might be with him, but Jesus sent him away, saying, "Return to your home and declare how much God has done for you." And he went away, proclaiming throughout the whole city how much Jesus had done for him.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, so now we have another story, another narrative, not a teaching thing like we had in the early part of chapter 8, but a story from Jesus' life. It is, people have often said, many ways similar to the one that we just read. The calming of the storm and the calming of demons is maybe not so different from Jesus' perspective or from the perspective of us who are struggling to understand the power of Christ over all things. Actually, if you think about the story we just read about the calming of the storm, and now this one of the casting out of the demons, and next week's story will be two healing miracles: the Jairus' daughter and the woman with the hemorrhage. is basically a progression of teachings about how Jesus has absolute authority over nature, demons, sickness, and death. All things are given into Jesus' power. And so all of the lessons are the same in that sense. We're trying, the Bible, if I can say it this way, is trying to help us understand that Jesus is a man, yeah, but absolutely unique among all men who ever have lived or who ever will live, because he's the only man who is a man and also who is God. And again, all of the gospel keep this story as well. So it's one of the important miracle stories in the Bible. It says, then they sailed to the country of the, and I don't know how to pronounce this either, Steve. I looked on the computer. Steve pronounced it Gerasenes.
I wasn't sure.
I heard on the computer Gerasenes, and I also heard it pronounced with a soft G, Gerasenes. So you never know when you go onto the computer and you look at, how to pronounce it, whether they're pronouncing it correctly or not. So however you pronounce it, we'll say Gerasenes to follow Steve. They sailed to the country of the Gerasenes, which is opposite Galilee. Now, it reads as if this is a continuation of the storm story, like they had the storm, and then Jesus calmed the storm, and then they continued their journey, and they got to the country of the Gerasenes, although this is really an open question. There's no reason to assume that that's the case. We're told that the story happened in a place opposite Galilee, all right, and most people have read this to mean on the other side of Lake Gennesaret, or also known as the Sea of Galilee, on the opposite side of the lake from Galilee, where most of the story has been happening, except if you have any experience with boats on large lakes, other side of the lake is a kind of a concept that could be implied in various ways. It doesn't necessarily mean, exactly on the opposite side of the lake. It could mean, you get in your boat and you sail to the other side, could be closer or farther. So we can't really know by this where it's located. Most of the people have understood that this place is less Jewish and more Gentile than where most of the stories happen so far. If indeed it's on the other side of the lake from Galilee, then it would be in many places that could be described as the other side, as the side opposite of Galilee. It would be in territories that were not Jewish. And that's kind of supported by the fact that the demons, when they go out into a herd of pigs. And nobody in Israel kept a herd of pigs. Pigs are like the signpost of Gentile lands, because Jews don't want to be anywhere near pigs. They're unclean. They don't eat them. They don't keep them. And even the fact that when he asked the man the name of the demons, and he says, our name is Legion, has a sort of Roman, military, non-Jewish, feel to it. So for these and perhaps a few other reasons, people have thought, well, maybe this story takes place not in the Jewish lands, but in Gentile lands. And just as the location is uncertain, as I already mentioned, the name of the place, and not just how to pronounce it, is uncertain. The different Gospels have different names, actually, for the place, and the different places have different pronunciations. And so I think that kind of stuff is probably beside the point. None of the details about the name of the location or the precise location of the place is important to understanding the story. What's important to Luke, I think, is he wants to do as good a job as possible of telling this important story, which the other gospel authors also want to remember, about the power and the authority of Jesus, this time not over nature, but over the evil spiritual forces. Luke only tells 3 exorcism stories, I think. It's not many, but definitely Luke believes in the existence of the devil and the existence of demons, and that they have a deleterious effect on people. All right, so we have this then, Luke's version of this story. So it says Jesus steps out onto land from a boat. either continuation from the previous story or not. Anyway, he's getting out of a boat. And immediately when he arrives, he's met by some guy from around there, a local man of that city, who has demons, Luke says. The word is plural here, demons plural. We know from reading the whole story, and Luke knew from having written the whole story, that eventually all the readers are going to realize that there are multiple demons inside of that guy. And so in setting up the story, Luke goes ahead and provides that information before the narrative even reveals that the man is possessed by demons, multiple demons. And Luke makes it clear from the start that this is not any ordinary case of demon possession. Not only are there demons plural, it seems, and that proves to be the case as we read on, but the eternal effects on this man are remarkable. All right? He's been living among the tombs with the dead people, naked, and for a long time. So I think that's a literal description that the church remembered of this man, because all three gospel authors pick up the same kind of language. But it's also worth noticing that this description of the man resonates with some passages in Old Testament prophecy and even some of the writings of the rabbis in Jesus' day as descriptions that you would expect to be applied to people who are possessed by demons. In other words, this guy comes through as a sort of classically and unmistakably possessed by demons kind of a character. Everyone would have understood by his physical description, as well as the fact that Luke provides that he's a man possessed by demons. And furthermore, that everybody around there would have had the same understanding. Everybody in this story, the townspeople, would have understood, yeah, that's the guy who's been naked out in the tombs, running around possessed by demons for a long time. So he's famous in his area for being the demon-possessed guy, and that's then when the story begins. And sorry to do this to you, but that's where the story begins, and since we already know from what Steve read, and we'll talk more about how the story ends, with this guy free of his demons, dressed in clothing, healthy, sitting at the feet of Jesus, and finally charged by Jesus to go out and proclaim the gospel in this area. Now think of the parable of the sower. Can you tell which soil is good soil? Would you ever have guessed that a guy possessed by demons, the way this guy's described, is actually a picture of good soil? Because he's going to bear fruit 100-fold. He's going to prove to be one of the people in the parable where the word is cherished and the word grows up and produces good fruit. So he's a kind of a good example for how you cannot tell by looking at people whether the word of God is going to take root in them or not. This crazy demon-possessed guy happens to be good soil. The Apostle Paul, who chased Christians around trying to kill them, happens to be good soil. And a lot of horrible people that we know, even ourselves, may not look anything like good soil, and yet the Word of God can grow up there. But now we're going to read about this guy, and it says, when he saw Jesus, he cried out and fell down before him and said with a loud voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me." And this expression, Most High God, is also not a very Jewish description of God. It's more of an expression heard in the Gentile lands, and it's another one of the tells people have for why they think that this drama is taking place outside of Israel and on the other side of the lake in Gentile territories. So we don't know how or why Jesus and this demon-possessed man came to be in contact, right? And I was thinking, just like we don't know why the storm swept the boat in the previous story, but one of the things we can be certain of in case of the storm and in case of the demon-possessed man is neither of those things were accidents. Both of them were under the control of God. And God's purposes are being served by both of these meetings, by the disciples in the storm and by Jesus and the demon-possessed man. These are things that are orchestrated by God. Jesus was never a tool of Satan. You can't read this story to think that the demons or that the devil or somebody was setting up this story. This was another lesson that Jesus is giving to the church of all time in his life, organized by God. So Jesus shows up by the providence of God. And upon seeing Jesus, the demon-possessed man reacts in a kind of an extreme way. He cries out in a loud voice. He accurately calls him Jesus, and he accurately calls him the Son of the Most High God. So he knows who Jesus is. He didn't know Jesus was coming, but when he saw him, he knew who Jesus was. And then it says he falls down before Jesus here. It fell down before him, which most people have understood not as worship, but as sort of craven supplication. He's afraid Jesus is going to do something to him, and so he sort of tries to make himself obsequious, or he's cowering or something like that. Although some people have seen in the man falling down before Jesus, yes, the demons had nothing but fear for Jesus and loathing, but maybe the man himself might have had some inkling of goodness which is present in kneeling down before Jesus, because later he's going to wind up at Jesus' feet again once the demons are gone. You can read that how you want to. But the demons recognize Jesus. They don't know why he suddenly showed up, but so they ask him what his intentions are. Right? And they find, it says, I beg you, do not torment me, which means they either find the presence of Jesus already to be a torment, or they fear that Jesus has come and is presently going to do something to torment them. So they're begging him either to stop tormenting me or don't torment me. But anyway, they think that Jesus is a source of torment, at least potentially for them. And so I asked myself, what is torment for a demon? I don't know if it's a question we can ask or answer. I mean, what would it mean for a demon to be tormented? It's hopefully hard for us to imagine what it would be like for a demon to be tormented, but it's evidently possible. And one of the answers you could give is, what must be torment for a demon to be in the presence of God or in the presence of Jesus? So just being close to Jesus must be a torment to the demon. John Calvin says torment for a demon is taking away from the demon the opportunity to possess and torment people. He says they delight in torturing God's creation, usually living beings, by possessing them and corrupting them and breaking up God's good creation. And so that's what they live for. And that if you were to put a demon someplace where he couldn't do that, then he might be in torment. And those are the two answers that I can think of. But things seem to be happening here which are causing the demon to be tormented or to fear torment. And then Luke seems to explain it in verse 29, which I've broken into two pieces just because it was too long to fit on a slide. So the first sentence in verse 29 says, for he, that is, because Jesus had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man. So he's shown up, surprisingly, I would argue orchestrated by God, that the demon can see who it is. Jesus says, go out of the man, and then the demon right away is saying, don't torment me. So Jesus' presence may be a torment. Jesus' command to leave the person he's been tormenting all these years may be a torment to the demon. But why did Jesus command the demon to go out is a question that seems to interest Luke. Because in the rest of verse 29, Luke seems to be explaining why it was that Jesus had commanded the demons to go out of the man. I was thinking, demons can't bother Jesus at all. They'll avoid him at all costs. If Jesus walked around in the world, he'd never see a demon, unless God had caused some encounter for our benefit. And demon hunting wouldn't be a hobby for Jesus, right? It's too easy for him. Wouldn't even be interesting for Jesus. Plus, he knows at the end of time, not only the demons, but the devil and all evil is going to be put under his feet and put away. So the devil's not a challenge to Jesus, and the devil's already lost. So the only reason why, so the demon has a reasonable question when he asks Jesus, why did you command me to come out of this man? What do you have to do with me, Jesus? Why are you stooping to order about demons, which are really far below Jesus in terms of power and majesty. And then 29, Luke seems to explain what Jesus is doing. Jesus isn't hunting for demons. Jesus is moved by his compassion, first of all, by the man who suffered so much through demon possession. He says, for a time it had seized him. He was kept under guard and bound with chains and shackles, but he would break the bonds and be driven by the demon into the desert. This is a very serious demon possession. He's been naked in the tombs for all of these years and so forth and so on. So Jesus has ordered the demons out for the benefit of the man who had been possessed, and the demons are kind of a secondary consideration to him. So Jesus asks the man, it says him, Jesus asks him, it doesn't say them, Jesus asked him, what is your name? And he said, Legion, for many demons had entered him. So the question is all singulars. Jesus seems to be speaking to the man, or if to a demon, to a single demon. But the man responds with this curious answer, and he says, my name is Legion, which is the word used to describe a cohort of Roman soldiers. So he's saying, my name is Legion because many demons had entered him. So it's a kind of a creative name. It's sort of ironic. If Jesus were asking the man, what's your name? He has no name because he's been possessed by all of these demons. And so you might as well call me Legion. I've been possessed by many demons. And so from a literary point of view, this verse 30 just gets the point out into our mind that it's not one demon, but many demons. Right? And it may also suggest that the demons had some kind of twisted military organization because a Roman legion was famous for being ordered, or not. That could be ironic also. Or it may mean that the demons have taken on the character of, the Gentile, the Roman occupying army or whatever. But anyway, from a literary point of view, basically it just lets us know that there are many demons. It's possible that there's more meaning here that you could fish out. You could wonder whether Jesus is addressing the man or the demons or both. You could wonder whether the man is answering on behalf of the demons or whether they've completely taken control of him so that whenever he speaks, they're speaking. And I thought about all that kind of stuff today, and I think none of that really matters to the story that Luke is mostly trying to tell. People are curious about that stuff, particularly people who make Hollywood movies are curious about that kind of stuff. But I think what's really going on here is just a demonstration of Jesus' character and his power and his authority. But one thing in here that I think is probably important to say is that Jesus did not need to know the name of the demon in order to control this situation. You see that a lot of times if you watch movies on The Exorcist or whatever, that there's a non-Christian exorcist logic that says you need to know the name of a demon to cast it out and stuff like that. That's not Christian at all. Jesus doesn't need any help to cast out this demon. Jesus could have uncreated him from the beginning of eternity. He could stand on his head and eat bananas and cast them out. Jesus can cast out demons however he wants to. There's no magic ever that's required by Jesus or by Christians in this sort of a way. And I think it'd be wrong and dangerous if you read your Bible to think you're reading instructions here about how to cast out demons, because that's not what Luke is doing. It's a story about the transcendent power of the unique Son of God. We're just supposed to see the majesty of Jesus. It's not a story about demons at all. Actually, it's just a story about how nothing can compare to Jesus or stand against him. All right, So anyhow, Luke's moved from the singular to the plural because you can see he's already put the idea in our mind that there's multiple demons now. These are plural pronouns here. They begged him not to command them to depart into the abyss. All right, so they're begging still. And we know that out of compassion for the possessed man, Jesus has commanded the demons to go out. And they're begging it comes to be more specific now, the nature of their torment. He's told them to go out of the man, but he hasn't told them where to go. Right? And they want to know, they want him not to command them to go into the abyss. The abyss is like a deep, bottomless pit, basically, which in those days was thought by some to be like the waiting place for the devil and the demons until the end when they would be destroyed. Anyway, it's a place out of this world, out of sight, out of mind. So perhaps following Calvin's idea, if he sent them to the abyss, they wouldn't be able to possess and torment God's creatures anymore, and that would be their torment. And so they've been commanded out, and they don't want to go to the abyss. They can't disobey Jesus. So now they're begging Jesus that he would command them or give them permission to enter this herd of pigs that's nearby. Mark said there were about 2,000 pigs. Luke doesn't tell us how many pigs there were, neither does Matthew. But anyway, since my way of thinking is that all of this has been arranged by God for our benefit, so that we could see the might of Christ arrayed against the spiritual forces. The herd of pigs were provided because they were helpful for what follows, for the lesson that follows. And Jesus allows the demons to go into the pigs. He gave them permission, it says. So from a Jewish perspective, this is actually, if Jews heard this story, they would laugh probably, because sending unclean spirits into unclean animals is kind of funny. What better place to send unclean spirits into than a bunch of unclean pigs from a Jewish perspective? Sending the demons out of the man who Jesus is going to help into pigs will satisfy Jesus' two objectives, I think. One is it's going to benefit the man. It'll be the outworking of his compassion towards the man who has a future in Jesus' kingdom as an evangelist, as we'll see. And also it's going to serve the purpose of the teaching lesson, which is going on here, which is teaching Jesus' disciples and the people in this area and all of us who have read the Bible in all the centuries since then, something about the great power of Christ and how we don't need to fear demons or any other power beside him. Right, so you might ask, well, why did Jesus allow the demons to possess the pigs? Because if you're an animal lover, if my wife was here, she would say, well, that would be bad for the pigs, and I guess it would be bad for the pigs. Or if you're a farmer, you might say, well, that would be bad for the farmer because pigs are expensive, and sending them into the lake is going to be bad for the farmer. Surely it will. And you might be surprised over the past 1,500 years how many people have spent a lot of time arguing about why Jesus allowed the pigs to be possessed by demons and run into the lake. And the only two answers that I can come up with are the one that's always hard. He can do it because he can do it. It says in the Psalms, God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. Everything in this world belongs to God. Everything. The pigs belong to God. The grass belongs to God. The sky belongs to God. God can use anything he wants to in nature, however he wants to. So who would say to God, you can't use these pigs for this purpose, is one kind of an answer. But another kind of answer, which may be more easy to take, is that this demonstration is intended to save human souls, potentially a lot of them. The lesson that's on display here is going to result in grabbing the attention of everybody in the region. It's going to take the man who is freed of demon possession to become a disciple of Christ who remains behind, charged to proclaim what Jesus has done for him to all of these people later on. And for 2,000 years, the church has been reading this story and drawing its ideas about the nature and the stature of Christ and his power and authority from this story. And so God knows what he's doing, and I think that we're probably, not to mix metaphors, but we're barking up the wrong tree if we're worried too much about why God chose to let the demons go into the pigs. It just made it easy for people to see what was going on, how seriously the men had been possessed, how great was the demonic force arrayed against Christ, how little did it bother him. 200, 2,000, 2 million, he doesn't care. It's just like the storm. He just says, go into the pigs, and they're gone. And so with his permission then, and it shows you, they need Jesus' permission. They can't do anything against his will. The demons came out of the man, entered the pigs. The herd rushed down the steep bank and into the lake where they were drowned. So the grammar makes it clear that the pigs died. Actually, literally translated, instead of drowned, it's suffocated. They drowned in the water, the pigs did. It's not clear what happened to the demons. Most people have thought that they wound up in the abyss anyway, the very place where they didn't want to go. The lake itself in those days would have been thought of as an abyss. Any sort of large body of water was an untamed, evil, sort of unruly, abysmal sort of force. And so they might have just seen the demons, thought they were going to escape the abyss. They asked Jesus for permission to go into the pigs. He said, okay. It enabled the people to see what was happening, yet the pigs died and the demons went into the abyss anyway. So some people have said Jesus played a trick on the demons, and other people have said that the demons played a trick on Jesus because by driving the pigs into the lake, they could cause all of the people in the area around there to become afraid and not want to talk to Jesus anymore. Lots of people have read these stories and thought of lots of things. And again, I would say even all of those things don't matter so much because the lesson that Luke is teaching about is about the absolute power of Jesus. So the story of the demons going into the pigs and running into the lake will have the effect of advancing the proclamation of the gospel in the Gentile lands and saving souls then and for dozens of centuries afterwards. And that's what's going on. Almost finished here, I know we're out of time. So it says, when the herdsmen saw what had happened, so the guys who were herding the pigs saw this happen, and they wouldn't have seen it if they hadn't gone into the pigs. You wouldn't be able to see demons otherwise. When the herdsmen saw what had happened, they fled and they told the city and in the country. So the news of Jesus' presence and power and authority over evil spirits was immediately sent away from the countryside and into the city and into the country. So this guy Jesus has come, and then that brings crowds of people back who had heard the news, so they go back to see what had happened. So you see the same sort of crowds building that you've seen on the other side of the lake, in the Jewish lands. They came back and they found Jesus and they found the man. And remember, this guy's famous for years. He's been running around naked and living, and they chained him up and he broke free. Surely everybody around there knew about the demon-possessed man and how seriously affected he was. They heard this story about the pigs going into the lake. Hard to believe, but it's a good draw to get people to come see what's going on. They get out there. The pigs, of course, are long gone. But what they see is this man now in his clothes, in his right mind, and sitting at the feet of Jesus. Right? And so he was exactly the opposite of what he had been. Just like the storm became calm, this crazily infested with demons guy becomes normal. But not just normal. Jesus just didn't restore him to normal. That would be tragic if that was all that happened here, is that the man was freed of his demons. The important thing to notice, I've underlined, I think, is that he's sitting at the feet of Jesus now. Before he was at the feet of Jesus, possessed by demons, pleading not to be sent into the abyss. That's one kind of fear of God, the demonic kind. Now he's at the feet of Jesus, and he may still, like a lot of other people around there, have the fear of God, but this is the other kind of fear of God, which is the beginning of all wisdom. He doesn't want to be separated from Jesus anymore. He wants to be never separated with Jesus, ever. He wants to stay with Jesus, we're told now. Right? So anyway, the story here about the demon-possessed man, verse 36 says it was told again. they told it, and now they're retelling, and it's been told and retold for centuries. Notice here, Jesus does not discourage them from talking about this. Sometimes Jesus tells people, take care not to tell anybody. But here, not only does Jesus not discourage this story from being told, he causes the story to be told, and later he's going to command the formerly demon-possessed man to go tell everybody about this story. And so this is a story that God wanted out there, pigs and all. This is a testimony that God desires to see spread. And so then it says, all the people of the surrounding country of the Gerasenes asked Jesus to depart from them, for they were seized with a great fear. So he got in the boat and returned. So you can see the initial reaction. We've seen this since the story of Jesus in his hometown of Nazareth. We see it again here in a sort of a different light. The initial reaction of nearly all people in this area is they want Jesus to go away. Why? They're afraid. What are they afraid of? Losing more pigs, maybe? Commercial loss? Supernatural events? It's scary to see demons flying around into pigs and going into the water. Afraid of God? Probably. They're not followers of Yahweh. The God of Israel is loose in their territory now doing strange and amazing things, so they may be afraid of God beneath it all. And so for some of them, or maybe even most of them in the beginning, this could be the beginning of the bad sort of fear of God, the sort of fear of God that makes you want to stay away from God. So they asked Jesus to go, and he did. And yet there's hope for these people, and the story ends on a note of hope. Because the man who had the demons begged Jesus that he could stay with him. So his fear is turned into a different kind of a fear and worship and desire to be with Jesus, like we saw in Capernaum back in the beginning of Luke's gospel. Do miracles for people and they'll be drawn. But Jesus doesn't let him have this kind of cheap grace. He'll say, of course you're going to follow me because I cast out your demons and now you're back to normal. Jesus doesn't let him have that. Jesus instead gives him a better gift. He sends him away and he gives him a job. And he tells him to return to his home and to declare how much God has done for you. And so the man goes away, proclaiming throughout the whole city how much Jesus had done for him. So now come back to the story of the parable of the sower. This guy, he was nothing like a picture of good soil in the beginning, possessed by demons and running around naked for years and years. And yet, he encounters Jesus, and all of the evil stuff is pushed away. And he's given a job, which is to go proclaim to the world about Jesus. And so he's bearing the hundredfold harvest, that Jesus thought about, or in Jesus' teaching before the lamp. Nobody lights a lamp to hide it under the bed. Jesus didn't light this guy's lamp for him to just follow Jesus around. There's enough light there already. He wants to hang the lamp in the Gentile lands, in the Gerasenes, and let the gospel shine there. And so it's a kind of a hard lesson and a hopeful lesson at the same time. When Jesus' power is manifest, many people are driven away. The demons want it to be as far away as possible. These people, a lot of them, want it to be as far away as possible at first. And yet, we know that some of those people, just like the demon-possessed man himself, will have a different ending to their story. Right? For some of those people who are actually the good soil from the parable, the word that this man proclaims, or that they hear proclaimed by other evangelists later, will go in and they'll be saved. So I think overall here, and then I'll just stop talking, is I think Luke is not trying to give lessons on how to cast out demons. He's not even trying to focus as much as I did on some of the sort of amazing and interesting things that happen with the demons being cast into the pigs and so forth and so on. What's really going on here, same with the Jesus calming the storm, is we're being shown, just as Jesus' own disciples are being shown bit by bit by bit, that Jesus' power is absolute. It's over nature, it's over evil spirits, it's over sickness, it's over death, it's over everything. Yes, he's a man, but he is also God. And not everybody is saved, but some people are saved by coming into contact with him.
それが一番救われるわけではないんです。
Comment or question?
質問があったら
If you have, please stay and talk to me afterwards, but I should pray now because as usual I've run over time. Heavenly Father, thank you for this day and thank you for continuing to speak to us. I pray that nothing that happens in this class, especially me, gets in between your word and the people who need to hear it. I think one of the things we're learning from studying Luke together is that there's nothing easy about understanding the man who was also God, Jesus Christ, our Savior. There's only ever been one of him, and there only ever will be one of him. And so we have no examples or comparisons, only we have Jesus. And you didn't necessarily need to explain to us about Jesus, but instead you've given us the Bible with so many things that we can read and pray over and try to understand about Jesus and who he is and what he means for us. And we pray that you'll reward the time that we spend poring over this gospel with deeper understanding at various points, not just so that we can know more stuff, but so that we can have a greater faith in you, O God, because we understand more and more how powerful you are and how great you are and how faithful you are and what you've done and how much you loved us by sending Jesus to save us. It's not that we need to try harder to have faith, Lord. It's just we need to understand better about how faithful you are and how much we can trust in you just because of who you are. And I hope that we get some of that from the Bible study that we do. Please help everybody to get home safely tonight. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.